Chapter 3 of The Beautiful Mrs. Davenant by Violet Tweedale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Ladies of Little Glentworth.
"Let's call this afternoon on Mrs. Davenant."
Major Claude Carlton, owner of Great Glentworth and all its broad acres, was seated at lunch with his mother under conditions which approached perfection. Superb health, above-average good looks, owner of a very fine property, with still ample means to keep it up, and not a personal care in the world. Such were the gifts the gods had showered upon him, and certainly he would have been duly grateful, had he ever considered his circumstances, but when a man has known no other condition of life, he is apt to take what is his as a matter of course. He believed that he lived a very active life, and there was no streak of indolence in his character, but after 5 years at the front his activities were now confined to doing the things he wanted to do and thoroughly enjoyed doing. A soldier's profession was by no means irksome to him, and he very readily and intelligently rendered a good account of his stewardship at home, not so much because the good of his dependents was a sacred duty, but because as a boy he had been taught that certain courses of action would be expected of him, and meant playing the game. He had come through the war without a scratch, and he never willingly referred back to his part in the terrible enterprise. Mrs. Carlton winked one eye, and the single monocle dropped on its wire. She ceased contemplating through the open window the lovely lands over which the glamour of the bright September day was cast. "Right-o, I suppose they've settled down by now. The companion, Miss Howard, isn't that her name? Must have been in residence for at least a fortnight."
"And Mrs. Davenant arrived the day before yesterday. Webb passed the car on the road coming from the station. Looked like a big Rolls-Royce, he thought. I'll be shooting tomorrow. I've asked Jim Hall, and I suppose you'll come out with us. Let's drive over this afternoon. Shall it be the car or the G's?"
"I'll drive the roans," decided his mother. "They've not been in harness this week. We can go to the Webbs if Mrs. Davenant's out. I owe them a call, but I hope she won't be out. I'm rather curious to see her. One has heard so much of her, and she's rather a mystery."
"Oh, don't know anything about a mystery. I used to hear of her entertaining in town before the war. She's a well-to-do widow with a beauty reputation. I've never heard anything but good of her,"
replied Claude, helping himself to half a cold partridge. Mrs. Carlton poured herself out a glass of Burgundy and held it up to the light. "No more have I, dear boy, but no one knows who or what her husband was, or where her wealth comes from."
"Oh, who cares a hang for any of those things? Blessed if I do,"
retorted her son. Mrs. Carlton smiled across at him in perfect agreement, and stroked down her back hair, which was cropped close to her head, like a man's, only more so. "I wonder she's never married again," she soliloquized aloud.
"Shows she's a woman of sense, my dear mother. What more does she want? She's got a rattling good social position and perfect freedom. She'd be mad to make a change, and she'll be an A1 tenant. I feel we ought to run over today and see if she wants anything done. I'm willing to meet her if there is."
Mrs. Carlton readily agreed, as she always did when her one and only child made a reasonable suggestion. He was master, a fact she never forgot, and while she continued to act as a chatelaine of his beautiful home, she kept ever before her the frailty of her tenure. She had endured 4 years of agony. Any day she might hear of her son's death. Now she calculated that any day Claude might fall in love and bring home a wife, and her reign would be over. She'd done well by the property, being preeminently a countrywoman coming of sound country stock, and when she married Squire Carlton of Great Glentworth, she had entered into his work in stable, farm, and garden in a practical, energetic, and knowledgeable manner. She still rode to hounds and schooled her home-bred hunters, and the home farm had never been let in her day, but was run, in her son's absence with his regiment, under her personal supervision by a competent bailiff. When Claude had finished his thoroughly British education, consisting of all the sports, a smattering of the dead, and no knowledge whatever of the modern languages, he entered the Guards. He might be, indeed he was, woefully ignorant of all social and political questions lying outside the tiny island of his birth, but he was a gentleman in the true sense of the word, and he understood that not to play the game was an unforgivable disgrace. During his periods of leave, which he always spent at home, he was well content to signify his approval of his mother's work, and leave his business affairs more or less in her hands. He was proud and extremely attached to his ancestral home. Those 3 sides of a square of old red brick masonry, with a tower in the centre, and the long, wide grass terraces running down to the trout stream below, could hold their own against any of the minor seats of the English nobility. He loved that side of English country life which is so invigorating and healthy for mind and body. He had always been keen on sport, and had been brought up in the saddle by his mother, and shown the way over the sticks before he was 10. She had seen to it that before he left Eton he rode straight and could bring down a woodcock or rocketer. That she had made a thorough man of her son was the fulfilment of her proudest ambition. A deep friendship existed betwixt mother and son. When the squire died, the result of a chill caught at the cover-side, Claude was only 7 years old, and the widow knew she had now to fill the role of both parents. The boy was thoroughly normal, daring, wild as a hawk, and up to any form of mischief, and so long as there was no tendency to vice, the mischief was encouraged. Sybil Carleton was enabled, owing to her splendid health and physical fitness, to share in all her son's pursuits, and they rode to hounds, stood at the cover-side, and strode the stubble side by side in perfect comradeship. The 5 years' nightmare was now a thing of the past. Claude had done well and come through. Mrs. Carleton did not think more of those 5 years than she could help, and her son helped her to banish the hideous memory. Now, at the age of 30, Claude still looked upon his mother as his best pal. There had of course been other women in his life, but so far they had been but episodes, and he seemed in no hurry to marry. He had just let his mother's dower house to Mrs. Davenport for a term of years, without giving her possible need of it a passing thought, and Sybil Carleton had not deemed it necessary to put in the smallest suggestion of her claim. As mother and son entered the drawing-room at Little Glentworth, Mrs. Davenant was also entering it by the conservatory door, and the 2 women as they shook hands presented a striking contrast. Mrs. Carleton's naturally dark skin was tanned by wind and weather to the shade of a ripe chestnut. Her lean face was a network of fine wrinkles, but her large brown eyes and excellent teeth were still in first-rate working order, and in its slender uprightness her figure was still that of a girl. The holland suit she wore was cut on the severest masculine lines, and the soft shirt and neat tie were in the same style and pattern as those of her son. In her hand she held a brown Homburg hat, which she always removed on entering a room, displaying an exceedingly smooth head of closely cropped iron-grey hair, white on the temples. She stripped off her loose doe-skin glove as she took Mrs. Davenant's soft palm in hers, and quite unconsciously surveyed her through the single monocle with the same appraising observation she bestowed upon her horses and cattle. "So pleased to meet you. Hope you're shaking down and finding all you require," she said genially. She liked what she saw. Yes, Mrs. Davenant deserved the epithet beautiful that was generally bestowed upon her, and though the antithesis of herself, Mrs. Carleton liked womanly women. There was too much of the male in her own composition to do otherwise. "A dangerous neighbour," was her first impression. Then she laughed aloud at her own thoughts and shot out her cuffs. "Well, why shouldn't he if he fancies her? It's time he settled." As she silently came to this conclusion, she turned to the introduction of Miss Howard, who just then entered.
An unusual pair of women,
she decided, as she sat down and discussed practical details, whilst her son conversed with Mrs. Davenant. Miss Agnes Howard was not young. She was at least 35, but she could scarcely have been handsomer at any time of her life than now. A big, grand-looking woman, with a clear olive complexion, no colour, regular features, fine blue eyes, and dark brown abundant hair.
"Whatever the mystery may be, they're both gentlewomen," concluded Mrs. Carleton, as she talked shrewd generalities,
for, though not choosing to argue out the subject with her son, she had made her own private inquiries from several generally well-informed sources.
"Yes," wrote her sister, Lady Tadcaster, who knew everyone and went everywhere. "Of course I know the beautiful Mrs. Davenant. Everyone dans le monde does, and everyone admires her immensely. She calls herself a widow, so I presume she is one, but I've never met anyone who knew the late lamented. He's something of a mystery.
Miss Howard lives with her as companion, but not one of the Howards. You'll find Mrs. Davenant charming, well-bred, rich, and very good-looking, also very attractive to men." The four latter words were heavily underlined, and certainly conveyed a warning.
The companion, I wonder," speculated Mrs. Carleton, as she studied Miss Howard, and noted the cut of her cream flannel coat and skirt, and the two fine diamond hoop rings she wore on her slim brown finger.
Meanwhile, Mrs. Davenant, with her much quicker vision, was taking in as a complete picture Major Carleton. She rather liked that quiet composure of manner which suggested the lord of the soil, though it was an absurd pose in these democratic days, she thought. She admired the big, strong type, the rather roughly cut features, the fair moustache and straight-looking blue eyes.
"I hope we're not disturbing you too soon after your arrival, but we thought perhaps we might be of some use to you. Possibly you might want some small alteration in the house or garden. I'd be glad to do anything that would add to your comfort."
He spoke rather slowly, in a pleasant voice, and his smile was as slow as his voice. She was conscious that he addressed her with a certain freedom, though without a trace of familiarity, and by that she understood instantly that he was a man accustomed to women, accustomed to share with them the beginnings and endings of varied experiences, thus finding, perhaps unconsciously, a freemasonry in his most casual meetings with a woman who has passed through similar phases of life. His knowledge of women in the past assisted his knowledge of women in the present.
"That's very kind of you," she answered with her sudden flashing smile, "but we're very comfy. The house is in excellent repair and quite up to date in essentials. I don't mind telling you I shouldn't have taken it otherwise. The domestic situation is far too strained to admit of water-carriers or lamp-cleaners. Every labour-saving contrivance helps in these modern times."
He nodded comprehendingly.
"Yes, I felt that when I put in the baths and electricity. I didn't want little Glentworth to remain empty. I'm glad you like the old place."
"I adore the old-fashioned non-essentials, Major Carleton." He turned his head and looked around the walls, that slow smile dawning on his face. He was back for the moment in his boyhood. His surroundings exhaled upon his spirit the atmosphere of a past generation.
"You'll like most of the neighbours," he told her. "Some of them may go a bit slow for the times we live in, but take them all round, they're not a bad lot, and we're all on good terms."
"I've met a neighbour already, and I want to hear more of her. We travelled down from town together. She's a Miss Thorne, a niece of Mr. Thorpe of the Lake House."
"Oh, old Thorpe!" Carleton laughed dryly. "You won't like him. That's to say, if you ever meet him, which is extremely unlikely. He's a most peculiar old chap, mad, of course, who owns one of the finest black and white timbered houses in England. He inherited it from a cousin, and though I believe he's absolutely rolling, he lives like a pauper. So a niece of his has arrived. It's the first time I've ever heard of anyone staying at the lake house. What's she like? I'm sorry for her."
"Oh, an interesting-looking girl, and a lady. Very fair and quiet in manner. She's a governess, and now she's having a holiday."
"Lor, what a place to spend a holiday in!" laughed Carlton.
"Let us form a conspiracy to make it a pleasant one for her," suggested Mrs. Davenant. Major Carlton looked incredulous.
"Why, you don't know what old Thorpe is," he exclaimed. "He won't allow any of us to cross his threshold. We've all had notice to keep our distance. Not that any of us want to beard the old idiot in his den, but when he first went into residence we offered him the usual neighbourly attentions. He accepted those civilly enough. Then there came a sudden change in his attitude. I did hear he had some sort of illness. Anyway, he changed utterly, and all of a sudden. And now he's never seen or heard of, and his door's closed to all and sundry."
Mrs. Davenant was listening very attentively, her deep blue eyes fixed on the speaker. "That's all very interesting and very mysterious," she said. "One would like to fathom the reason for the sudden change, for of course there is a reason."
"The only reason is that Thorpe's a mad old ass," commented Carlton a trifle impatiently.
"Forgive my saying, that shows rather a lack of imagination on your part, Major Carlton. However, what you told me only confirms my determination to dig out Miss Thorne. Her uncle can't prevent her from crossing this threshold. I shall write to her tonight and ask her to lunch. Perhaps Mr. Thorpe will leave her all his money, and she'll end a great heiress." Carlton was listening with a sort of unwilling admiration. He liked her interest in the poor little governess, but old Thorpe as a subject of conversation bored him. He shook his head. "There's an heir already on which the place is entailed. I've not seen him, but I've heard of him in the neighbourhood. A man somewhere between 25 and 30, unmarried, an engineer by profession, and a Thorpe by name. You're right about my not being an imaginative chap. That isn't my line. But you'll be able to exercise any imagination you've got, for you'll hear the wildest rumours about the lake house. It's got a splendid Christmas number reputation for being alive with ghosts. Half the folk here would refuse to set foot within its gates, the other half are simply aching to begin investigations. But old Thorpe can be trusted to keep them all at bay." "I know which side I'll join," Mrs. Davenant told him, and her eyes had a dancing sparkle. "I'm for investigation. Meanwhile, I'll write to the girl and find out if she's had any weird experiences. Now, do tell me of the other neighbours."
"We're your nearest, and I hope we'll see lots of you, Mrs. Davenant. Don't let's stand on ceremony. There's nothing stiff about us, and I hope you'll look in as often as you can. My mother's a busy woman, but she's never very far away from the stables, and she's nearly always in to tea. It'll cheer her up to see you. Then there's Parson Warburton, a rattling good chap, whose sister lives with him at the vicarage. And there's the Halls. He's master. You ride, of course."
"No," confessed Mrs. Davenant, "not now, but I'll keep a mount in the stables for any friend."
"That's right. Nothing like encouraging local sport. Hall's a first-rate master, and Mrs. Hall's not to be despised across country, hard as nails and any amount of pluck. They're a young couple with a brace of kids. She's an American, with a pile made out of linseed, and she's very good to Jim."
Mrs. Davenant's butler at that moment opened the door and announced, Captain and Mrs. Hall. Carlton rose to his feet with a laugh.
By Jove, talk of angels, and they're sure to appear. You're going to have the whole county down on you.
Mrs. Davenant glanced over her shoulder at him with one of her flashing smiles. It was her gaiety that up to now had impressed him most. The more the merrier. How do you do, Mrs. Hall? Major Carlton was just telling me what a flyer you are across country. The master's wife has got to have a look in somewhere, or she'll find herself nowhere, retorted Mrs. Hall practically. Besides, I've had to keep the pack together more or less while he was soldiering.
Hello, Jim.
Hello, Claudie, remarked the two men, smiling broadly at one another, each vastly comforted by the presence of the other. Sadie Hall seated herself beside Mrs. Davenant, crossed her exquisite little feet and her white-gloved hands over a jewelled lorgnette, and opened huge black eyes upon her companion. She had not been born good-looking, but she had achieved good looks.
"I've just been perishing to see you, Mrs. Davenant. I've heard so much about you."
"I shan't reply with the obvious," laughed Hilda. "I think it kind of you to come and see me so soon. That's how I feel about it. Isn't paying calls in the country different to calling in London? There the dread is that the lady will be at home. Here the dread is that she'll be out." "Oh, that's only because in town there are so many tea-shops," retorted Sadie Hall briskly. "At Turlingham, that's our place, everyone who calls is offered tea whether I'm out or in. The country's a very fatiguing place to live in." "I should have said the reverse," smiled Mrs. Davenant. "I've come here to rest. I'm tired of town and its rush." Mrs. Hall looked astonished. "Why," she cried, "what happens directly I come back to Turlingham after a holiday abroad or in town? Constant streams of visitors, from the vicar to the village blacksmith, and all wanting something. Teas, treats, clothing, subscriptions, giving prizes, opening bazaars, mothers' meetings, and local clubs. My life here is one long sacrifice." "Oh, come now and have some tea. We have it in the morning-room. I love to sit round tea of the nursery order, don't you?" laughed Mrs. Davenant. "Will you lead the way? You know so well," she added, turning to Mrs. Carlton.
By Jove, how ripping the old place looks. I haven't been in it for years,"
said Captain Hall, who had manoeuvred himself into a seat next to his hostess.
"I'm not sure I don't prefer it to Great Glentworth. A big house isn't all beer and skittles, even if you have got lots of the needful to keep it up."
Hall was a neat, small man, built like a jockey, clean-shaven and in feature almost effeminate, but there was nothing feminine in his nature. He glanced round approvingly at the faded rep curtains, the old dumb waiters, and the sideboard, on whose shining mahogany Georgian silver shone. He considered Sadie's taste was much too French. She had packed several lumber-rooms, with all the grand old wine-coolers and claw-legged tables she could collect, and substituted what he called spindle-legged foreign trash. Now he looked enviously at the dark red walls clothed with the old-fashioned flock paper, at the few old family portraits shining out of heavy carved frames, and the tea-table with its bright-coloured Crown Derby and dainty edibles. All contributed to touch him with many subtle associations, and Mrs. Davenant herself seemed to fit the period. She might have stepped out of a Romney portrait, in her soft white chiffon frock belted with blue, the blush roses at her breast, and the richly piled dark brown hair framing her delicately tinted face.
A real beauty, and no mistake," thought the captain. Aloud he said, "The old squire used to call this the Red Parlour. Lady Alicia, she was his wife, used to sit in it. I can see her now, though I was a mere kid at the time, seated by the window, sewing. She's been dead for the last 25 years at least. Do you play bridge, Mrs. Davenant?"
She shook her head. "No, I don't, but Miss Howard does. You may rope her in if you like. The fact is, Captain Hall, I don't do anything."
You seem to do nothing jolly well. I suppose we are rather a busy lot hereabouts. Anyway, we were busy before the war, and we're beginning to be busy again, I'm glad to say. When hunting's off, there'll be a bit of a season to get through. My wife enjoys her theatres and dances. Then there's the shooting and the cubbing season on before one's time to turn around. I believe in lots of work. Keeps a man fit, don't you think? Carlton's a busy chap, too, always about when he's on leave. Great Glentworth takes a bit of looking after.
Miss Howard was pouring out tea at the other end of the table, and the rest of the party were chattering together very vigorously. Under cover of their conversation, Mrs. Davenant lowered her voice and leaned towards her companion. "I rather wonder Major Carlton let little Glentworth. It's the Dower House, isn't it? Why, it might be needed any day." Captain Hall thought a moment. He hadn't caught the drift of the remark.
"Oh, I twig now. Oh, why, of course I hadn't thought of that, but Claudy doesn't seem in any hurry to make up his mind."
"Falling in love isn't making up your mind. It's having your mind made up for you, Captain Hall." The master again pondered this proposition.
"By Jove, I believe you're right. What a clever lady you are,"
he conceded admiringly, and involuntarily he glanced at his wife with a broad smile.
"Takes you all of a heap, you mean?"
"If you like to put it that way. I think falling in love's the best occupation there is for both women and men. As a matter of fact, if we want to develop the best in us, we ought always to be in love with someone. Love is so progressive, so educative." The captain opened his blue eyes, and instinctively there shot into them a question he had almost forgotten how to ask since he married his Sadie and went to the war. Formerly he had not troubled to be sure of his ground. If knocked down, he knew how to get up again. Now he was more wary. Was it possible that Mrs. Davenant was out for adventure? He met her dancing eyes. Then he knew where he stood.
"Straight as a die, right as rain," was his swift conclusion. "I'm with you. Yes, rather. Keeps us out of mischief. Yet falling in love is sometimes rather dangerous," he ended with a reversion to caution.
"All fascinating pursuits are dangerous. They wouldn't be fascinating if they weren't," retorted Mrs. Davenant. As the master met her eyes, he felt in sudden need of assistance.
"Oh, hear that, old chap?"
he exclaimed, turning to Carlton, who had fallen into silence beside Mrs. Hall.
"Oh, Mrs. Davenant thinks the best occupation for us is falling in love." "Oh, well, you're out of the running, Jim," chaffed Claude with his slow smile.
"Captain Hall has localized my remark. I spoke in generalities," she retorted. "Love's a joy we're all the better for. It's a poor life that's lived without it. That's what I tried to infer." "You seem to have hit on a rather intimate sort of topic," suggested Sadie whimsically. "Love is the commonest topic, bar one, in the world," retorted Mrs. Davenant coolly, as she took a cigarette from the box in front of her. "And what is the commonest topic of all?" asked Sadie. "Hate. Do you smoke, Mrs. Hall? Pass around the box, please, Major Carlton, and don't think me ridiculously old-fashioned."
"I think there's much less falling in love now than there was in my young days. Men have grown so selfish,"
said Mrs. Carlton, hunting one capacious pocket after another for cigarettes and matches. Mrs. Davenant shook her head gently as she rose. Her smile was almost regretful, and her shining eyes looked dreamy and full of reminiscence. "I simply adore men," she said.
That was my grandfather." Claude felt compelled to throw into the pool of silence something blatantly unemotional. It was not what he wanted to say, but it was the first idiotic remark that floated through his brain. He turned his back upon everyone. He felt a shyness he could not understand, and pointed to a portrait of a man of about 25, clad in a jockey's dress and about to mount a sleek and well-bred horse. His hand was on the reins, but his face was turned round to the spectators, as though giving some final order before he set out. Mrs. Davenant stood by Carlton's side and looked up at the picture. She seemed to speak quite mechanically. "I love those old-fashioned portraits of squires with their favourite mounts." "That was his famous mare that won so many steeplechases. She realised £4,000 in stakes one year, though she cost my grandfather thrice that sum in lost wages. He backed her against anything. She was a clinker, and though, as you see, she'd one white stocking, which was thought a blemish, he'd never allow that she wasn't perfect. She'd a box and paddock to herself, and a couple of grooms to wait on her, and during one very hard winter he had a straw yard roofed in for her, so that she might exercise under cover."
She broke his neck for him. However, it's the death he would have chosen," remarked Mrs. Carlton grimly.
"Do you use the room we call the squire's den? It's hardly suitable for a woman."
Mrs. Davenant walked to the end of the room and threw open a door. Carlton followed her. It was a cosy little den, decorated after the family fashion with portraits of horse and hound, the possession of which had at various periods dignified the Carlton race. Stuffed fish of portentous size that had fallen victims to rod and landing net decorated the walls. The bell ropes were foxes' brushes, and on the mantel-shelf was a mighty drinking horn with silver rim, the contents of which Carlton's ancestors had been wont to empty at a draught before being helped to bed. The window looked out on a fine old stone court. Perhaps it was of all the rooms in the house the one most redolent of the family fragrance, and when Claude walked in, a crowd of memories rushed forth to greet him, memories which, although hardly hallowed, had a certain impressiveness. All those jolly sportsmen, dicers and drinkers that he had so often heard of had been his kith and kin, and were now dead, though their memories seemed evergreen.
"It was in this room I smoked my first cigarette," he said, with a slow smile of recollection. "Lor, how ill I was after! And one of my earliest interests was in that old print of the prize fight. That old boy is old Q at 90 years of age. I'd like to take just a turn round the garden, if it won't bore you too much. I've got such ripping recollections of the gardens here. In summer and autumn there was always a jolly scent of thyme and old-fashioned flowers, a fine old English aroma of sweet smells, and a bee hum and murmur from morning till night in the lime walks leading to the river. Do you keep this door locked?" He pointed to a heavy curtain. "On the inside." She was listening to him in a curious meditative melancholy. Her voice was almost sombre, but she slipped behind the curtain, and in another moment they stood outside together. "I say, don't you want a hat or something?"
Her gay air returned suddenly. "Oh, not I. Let us stroll down the lime walk and listen to the bees humming." At first their conversation consisted of inevitable commonplaces, but he was receiving new impressions of her which had nothing to do with what they said. The sun-blinds had been down outside the rooms they had been in, and he had not noted that her skin was free from the least trace of cosmetics, yet it had the fresh and delicate tints of a girl's complexion. Her dress also, now that he saw it in the full sunset splendour flaming in the west, roused in him a new train of thoughts that in the last few years he had almost forgotten. Small details in it for which he had no name brought whiffs of Monte Carlo and Nice, casinos and moonlit terraces. But such thoughts were blent with others of a different order. There was something tragic in her face. A shadow seemed always to lie under the surface of her gay light-heartedness, and the expression of her eyes was sometimes sombre, even when her lips smiled. "I'm glad you wish to come out into this heaven-born evening," she said. "I think I was beginning to feel a little shy." He glanced quickly round at her with a trace of astonishment. "Oh, that's the last failing I should have accused you of. You appear to me to be a perfect woman of the world." There was a little sparkle between her eyelashes as she answered in her sunny voice, "Not of your world, Major Carlton. I am shy of country life just as I am shy of church." "But not, I trust, of me," he retorted quickly, watching her down-dropped head. "Oh, no, but then you're different. I'm at home with you because you've known lives somewhat similar to mine. Men's lives." Her face grew full of memories. The fibre of her nature seemed unstrung. He watched her, puzzled and fascinated. What did she mean? He hardly knew what to make of her. "I'm glad we've got something in common," he said rather gravely, "though I don't know that men's lives, even the best of them, are up to much. I fear you place us on too high a pedestal. More is always expected of women than of men." He was thinking now of her words, "I adore men." He saw her shoulders shrug. "Oh, not now so much as formerly. Men are fairer now to women. They do begin to acknowledge that human nature is similar in both sexes. You do permit us to own up to the same passions with which you are liberally endowed." Their eyes met, and he was conscious of an undefined intimacy. They fell to a sudden silence as they strolled together with slow paces, their feet rustling among the brown leaves of the previous year. It was a day when the beauty of nature made itself felt like tender music that yet had no sound. The air was warm and fragrant, and of ethereal clearness which draped the landscape in the softness of velvet. The old grassy street through which they walked was arched by giant limes, and beneath their emerald arches shot slanting sunbeams. At the end of the green alley, flashing in the sheen of sunset, flowed the river, but even as they walked, like the sigh of a spirit, swept out from the west the first intimation of waning light, of the mysteries of coming darkness. "Listen to the humming of the bees." They both stood still and listened to the wonderful volume of sound, like a grand rhythm of praise rising up to the illuminated heavens.
"Isn't it ripping to be away from all the infernal botherations of ordinary life?"
he asked involuntarily. She looked at him in silence. She wondered how he contrived, when he chose, to drop ordinary life by the wayside. She had found it impossible to do so.
"I shan't forget this evening in the lime walk."
His voice dropped almost to softness as he quoted,
"It may be it shall please you to remember those silver stems, this shadowy woodland way, to think upon one sun-perfumed September, perchance, some day."
Do you know the lines? They are Watson's. The British Army discovered poetry in 1914. She kept her eyes upon his face. Everything else seemed to have stopped, except the action and influence of two souls, one upon the other. "And this is what I was thinking," she almost whispered. "And in that forest synagogue, whose aisles are paved with bloom and sod, a broken heart may haply find the tenderness of God." He withdrew his eyes from hers and stared straight before him, as if he had not heard her. A little frown had gathered on his brow, and he felt unaccountably stirred. He had learned to love poetry for its own sake, not for the emotions it could arouse. He was not given to feeling emotional. He hated the word, and thought he despised such feelings. A vague irritation stirred him.
"Oh, come, I must be returning," he said, glancing at his watch. "It's getting late."
From the distance came the faint sounds of voices and happy laughter. "Yes," she echoed, "it is getting late." They turned with one accord. As they retraced their footsteps, they were silent. It is getting late. The simple words took on another significance in Claude's mind. Was he letting time run on, and life slip away from him before he had realized what it held? Her words assumed a warning. It was getting late. Soon it might be too late. His 30th birthday was an hour in the past.
"Come along, Claudie, we must be getting back. The roans have got the fidgets and are digging graves in the gravel."
Mrs. Carleton, with her single eyeglass firmly fixed, and her Homburg hat cocked at the correct angle, stood by her horses. She shook hands genially with her hostess, and gathered up the ribbons preparatory to mounting the high mail phaeton.
"Hope to see you soon at our place, Mrs. Davenant. So long, Jim. We meet tomorrow for a day in the stubbles," she called out from aloft, giving a loose rein to the roans, who were poised on their hind legs ready to spring forward. The gravel spurted in showers. Another moment and the carriage had disappeared. Only the fast even trot of the roans racing home to their evening feed was borne back to the onlookers. End of chapter 3.